The bright lights of the diplomatic chamber aboard the Horizon hummed quietly as Lieutenant Commander Jinnah adjusted her formal uniform one last time. This was the moment humanity had been working toward for decades. First contact with the Valaxians, one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy. "Remember," Captain Lee said quietly beside her, "their ambassador's transmission mentioned they have different customs about personal space. Just follow their lead." Jinnah nodded. At 34 years old, she had risen quickly through the ranks of Earth's diplomatic corps, thanks to her gift for understanding alien cultures. She had mediated trade agreements with the mercantile Bolar and helped establish peace with the warrior Trelkins. But the Valaxians were different, mysterious, advanced, and extremely private. "They're docking now," announced the communications officer. The airlock doors slid open with a soft hiss. Jinnah straightened her shoulders as three tall figures entered. The Valaxians moved with fluid grace, their iridescent exoskeletons catching the light. They had 4 arms and walked upright on 2 legs, with large compound eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The one in the center wore elaborate decorations on its carapace, clearly the leader. This had to be High Emissary Reltak. "Welcome aboard the Horizon," Jinnah said clearly, stepping forward with a practiced smile. "I am Lieutenant Commander Jinnah, diplomatic representative of Earth and the United Planetary Alliance." Reltak tilted his head. Jinnah had been told they were identified as male in human terms, and his antennae quivered slightly. "We acknowledge your greeting, representative of Earth. I am High Emissary Reltak of the 7th House, voice of the Valaxian Concordat." His voice had an odd musical quality, translated through the universal translator each human wore on their collar. The 2 aides behind him remained silent, standing perfectly still. Captain Lee moved forward to stand beside Jinnah. "We are honored by your presence, High Emissary. We hope this meeting marks the beginning of friendship between our peoples." "Indeed," Reltak replied. "The Concordat has observed your species with interest. Your rapid advancement is unusual." Jinnah recognized the slight hesitation as diplomatic caution. Many older species found humanity's quick technological progress alarming. "We are eager to learn from those with greater experience," she said smoothly. "Perhaps we can exchange knowledge that benefits us both." The Valaxian's compound eyes seemed to focus more intensely on her, a refreshing perspective. Most young species wish only to acquire, not to share. Jinnah smiled, feeling the first rush of success. This was going well. The briefing materials had described the Valaxians as standoffish and difficult to impress. "We've prepared a simple ceremony to honor your visit," she said, gesturing toward a table where ceremonial gifts had been arranged. "Would you care to examine our offerings?" "Acceptable," Reltak said, moving forward with surprising fluidity. Jinnah guided him toward the display, carefully maintaining what she thought was a respectful distance. The gifts included water from Earth's deepest oceans, seeds from rare plants, and digital libraries of human culture, all carefully selected to demonstrate Earth's diversity without overwhelming the visitors. "This water comes from our Pacific Ocean," Jinnah explained, pointing to a crystal vial. "It contains microorganisms unique to our world." "Fascinating," Reltak said, leaning closer. "Your world's biodiversity is remarkable." Jinnah felt a wave of pride. The diplomatic team had debated for weeks about which gifts would most interest the scientifically advanced Valaxians. "And this," she continued, reaching for an ornate box, "contains a selection of." Her hand accidentally brushed against Reltak's lower right arm as they both reached for the box. The room went completely silent. The 2 Valaxian aides instantly moved back, their body posture changing dramatically. Their antennae stood straight up in what Jinnah would later learn was an expression of shock. Reltak froze, his compound eyes fixed on the point where their limbs had touched. Then he slowly looked up at Jinnah, his voice now carrying a strange vibration that the translator struggled to convey. "You touched me." Jinnah immediately stepped back. I apologize if I violated a custom. It was completely accidental. You touched my person without formal permission, Reltak continued, as if she hadn't spoken. You touched a noble of the 7th house without the ritual of approach. Captain Lee moved forward quickly. High Emissary, please accept our sincere apologies for any offense. We're still learning your customs. The room's atmosphere had changed completely. The two aides were making clicking sounds to each other, and Jinnah noticed the security team subtly shifting into alert positions around the room. This is not about offense, Reltak said, his voice now carrying an odd formality. This is about law, ancient law, binding law. Jinnah felt her stomach tighten. Something was very wrong. What law have I violated? She asked carefully. Whatever it is, I assure you it was unintentional. Reltak's antennae were now moving in complex patterns. The law of physical boundaries, established in the third age of our civilization. When an unbonded noble is touched without ritual permission, it creates a bond that cannot be broken. Captain Lee stepped forward. Surely there are exceptions for those who don't know your customs. The law predates interspecies contact, Reltak replied. It has no provisions for ignorance. Jinnah felt her training take over as she worked to salvage the situation. High Emissary, perhaps you could educate us about these laws so we can ensure no further violations occur. It is too late for education, Reltak said, his voice rising. The bond has been initiated. The two aides had moved to positions that Jinnah now recognized as ceremonial, standing at precise angles to their leader. What exactly does this bond mean? Jinnah asked, trying to keep her voice steady as warning signals flashed in her mind. Reltak's compound eyes seemed to catch every light in the room as he drew himself up to his full height, nearly 7 feet tall. You touched me without permission, human. The law says you must be my mate. The translation echoed in the suddenly silent room. Jinnah felt as if the artificial gravity had suddenly failed. Your mate, Captain Lee repeated carefully. The bond is clear, Reltak continued. Physical contact with a noble outside ritual context establishes a life partnership under our oldest laws. Lieutenant Commander Jinnah is now bonded to me under Valaxian law. Jinnah struggled to process what was happening. There must be some misunderstanding. On Earth, accidental contact has no such meaning. Your Earth customs are irrelevant to Valaxian law, one of the aides spoke for the first time. The High Emissary has been claimed. Captain Lee stepped between them. This seems like something that requires further discussion and cultural exchange before any conclusions. There is nothing to discuss, Reltak interrupted. The bond is established. Lieutenant Commander Jinnah must return with me to complete the ritual of acceptance. The Concordat will recognize no other diplomatic contact until this matter is resolved. The security team was now visibly tense, hands hovering near their weapons. Jinnah took a deep breath, her diplomatic training taking over despite her shock. High Emissary, while I respect your traditions, this requirement is unexpected. Perhaps we could discuss alternatives that honor your customs while respecting mine. There are no alternatives, Reltak said. This is not negotiable. The bond must be honored, or there will be no relations between our peoples. He turned to his aides. Prepare to depart. The human will accompany us. Wait, Jinnah said quickly. I need time to consult with my superiors. This is beyond my authority to decide. Reltak's antennae twitched in what might have been annoyance. You have until the next orbital cycle. Then you must choose. Honor the bond or end all possibility of alliance between our species. With that, the Valaxians turned and moved with precise steps back toward the airlock, leaving the humans in stunned silence. As the door closed behind them, Captain Lee turned to Jinnah. What just happened? Jinnah stared at her hand, the hand that had accidentally brushed against an alien and apparently changed the course of human-Valaxian relations forever. I think, she said slowly, I just got engaged to an alien over a handshake. Jinnah stared at the holographic display of Valaxian law texts, her eyes tired after hours of reading. 3 weeks had passed since the disastrous first contact, and Earth's position was growing more precarious by the day. "Any breakthroughs?" asked Admiral Park, the newly arrived diplomatic crisis specialist. He looked as tired as Jinnah felt. "Nothing useful," she replied, rubbing her temples. "Their laws are absolutely clear. Physical contact with a noble without ritual permission creates a binding mate bond. No exceptions." The small conference room aboard the Horizon had become Earth's emergency command center. Screens displayed messages from anxious government officials back home, all asking variations of the same question. How had a simple handshake derailed humanity's entrance into the Galactic Federation? The Valaxian High Council sent another message, Admiral Park said, sliding a datapad across the table. "They won't proceed with Earth's admission unless you honor the binding contract with Reltac." Jinnah picked up the pad and skimmed the message. "They're offering a compromise. I can maintain my Earth citizenship and continue diplomatic work if I agree to the bond." "It's still completely unreasonable," Park replied. "We can't have our lead diplomat forced into a relationship with an alien, regardless of what they call it." Jinnah set down the pad, thinking carefully. "I've been studying their culture. These mate bonds aren't what we initially thought. They're more like business partnerships with ceremonial elements. That doesn't make it acceptable." "No, but it makes it different," Jinnah said. "And right now, different might be all we have to work with." The Admiral frowned. "Earth Command is considering withdrawing our Federation application rather than submitting to this demand." Jinnah straightened in her chair. "That would be a massive mistake. The Federation's protection is vital for Earth's future security. The Krill invasions at the edge of our sector are getting worse. Without Federation backing, we're vulnerable." "I know that," Park said quietly, "but we can't sacrifice one of our own officers to alien customs." Jinnah was about to respond when her personal communicator buzzed. The message was brief. "Request private meeting. Matters to discuss. Reltac." "The High Emissary wants to meet with me," Jinnah said, surprised. "Privately." Admiral Park looked alarmed. "That's not happening. Not without security and witnesses. With respect, sir, this might be our only chance to find another solution." Jinnah stood up. "I'm trained for delicate diplomatic situations. Let me talk to him." After 30 minutes of debate, Jinnah found herself in a small neutral meeting room aboard a Federation observer vessel. 2 security officers waited outside, and everything was being recorded for her protection. When Reltac entered, Jinnah was struck again by how graceful the Valaxians moved despite their exoskeletal structure. Without his formal attire, he appeared less intimidating, though still undeniably alien. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Reltac said, his antennae moving in what Jinnah now recognized as a greeting pattern. "I'm hoping we can find a solution that satisfies both our peoples," she replied carefully. Reltac settled into a specially designed chair. "I sense your reluctance regarding our bonding. This is understandable." Jinnah chose her words with care. On Earth, bonds like marriage are entered willingly, with mutual consent and affection. Being bound to someone through an accidental touch violates our core values about personal choice. "Fascinating," Reltac said, his compound eyes fixed on her. "Your species places individual preference above social structures. In many matters, yes, especially regarding personal relationships." Reltac was silent for a moment, his antennae moving in complex patterns. "May I speak, unofficially? Without the weight of my position?" Jinnah nodded cautiously. "Our customs are ancient," Reltac said, his voice softer. "They emerged when our telepathic abilities were stronger. Physical contact once caused dangerous psychic overloads between unprepared minds. The rituals were protection, not merely tradition." This was new information. Jinnah leaned forward. "You're telepathic." "Our ancestors were strongly so. Modern Valaxians retain only fragments of this ability. He made a gesture Jinnah didn't recognize. But our laws remain unchanged for thousands of years. Do you personally believe I should be bound to you over an accidental touch? Jinnah asked directly. Reltak's antennae froze momentarily. Surprise, she guessed. No one had probably ever asked his personal opinion before. I have questions about certain traditions, he admitted quietly. But I am High Emissary. My duty is to uphold our ways. Jinnah sensed an opportunity. On Earth, we have a saying. Traditions should guide us, not imprison us. An interesting perspective, Reltak said, but not one shared by our High Council. They insist the bond be honored before any further relations with Earth proceed. Jinnah took a deep breath. What exactly would this bond entail? If, hypothetically, I were to agree. Reltak seemed to relax slightly. The bond is primarily a political and social alliance. We would be connected in public standing. Your status would equal mine in Valaxian society. We would have certain obligations to support each other's endeavors. And physically? Jinnah asked, uncomfortable but needing clarity. Physical relations are not required, Reltak said quickly. That aspect is separate in our culture. Mate bonds are about alliance, not reproduction. Jinnah nodded slowly. So more like a business partnership with ceremonial elements. An imperfect comparison, but closer to truth than your concept of marriage, Reltak agreed. For several minutes, they discussed specific details of what the bond would mean. With each explanation, Jinnah realized that while still problematic, the situation was less dire than Earth had feared. May I ask something personal? She said finally. Reltak's antennae moved in assent. If you have doubts about some traditions, why enforce this one so strictly? Reltak was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Change comes slowly to old civilizations. Some of us see the need for evolution, but direct challenge would damage the social fabric. You're saying you need change from outside, Jinnah realized. An external reason to reconsider old ways. Reltak didn't confirm this directly, but his antennae movements spoke volumes to Jinnah's trained eye. What if, she said slowly, I agreed to a temporary bond? One with defined terms and a clear endpoint after sufficient cultural exchange. Such an arrangement has no precedent, Reltak said, but Jinnah noticed he didn't reject the idea outright. Perhaps that's exactly why it could work, she suggested. A special arrangement that honors your traditions while respecting mine. When Jinnah returned to the horizon, Admiral Park was waiting anxiously. Well, what happened? I have a proposal, Jinnah said. One that might save Earth's position while preserving my autonomy. Over the next week, Jinnah worked tirelessly with Earth's diplomatic team and Valaxian representatives to craft an unprecedented agreement. The temporary cultural exchange bond would officially recognize the mate bond for diplomatic purposes while establishing clear limitations and an exit clause after 2 Earth years. On the day of the signing ceremony, Jinnah stood in her formal uniform, facing Reltak across a small table. Are you certain about this? Admiral Park asked one final time. Jinnah nodded. The Federation protection is worth temporary personal inconvenience. And, she hesitated, I think there's more happening here than just following tradition. Reltak isn't what I expected. The ceremony was brief but solemn. Jinnah followed the prescribed rituals, carefully touching Reltak's outstretched limbs in the correct sequence. When it was done, a murmur went through the watching Valaxians. The bond is formalized, Reltak announced. Lieutenant Commander Jinnah now holds the status of diplomatic consort to the 7th House. Earth's petition for Federation membership may proceed. Later, in a private moment, Reltak approached Jinnah. You have done something extraordinary today. I've temporarily solved a diplomatic crisis, she replied with a small smile. You have done more than that, he said quietly. You have created a precedent, a first modification of an unchangeable law in 600 years. Jinnah looked at him with new understanding. You planned this, didn't you? Not the accidental touch, but what came after. Reltak's antennae moved in what Jinnah was beginning to recognize as amusement. I could not have planned such a perfect accident. But once it happened, yes, I saw opportunity. Opportunity for what? Jinnah asked. For necessary change, Reltak said simply. Old ways must sometimes yield to new realities. You humans are remarkably adaptable. Perhaps some of that quality might benefit my people. As Jinnah prepared to depart for the Valaxian homeworld the next day, part of her new obligations as diplomatic consort, she realized that this accident might turn out to be the most important moment in human-Valaxian relations, and perhaps in its own strange way, the beginning of something unexpectedly meaningful. The Valaxian capital city of Krulter stretched before Jinnah like an enormous living sculpture. Buildings of iridescent crystal and organic-looking metal curved toward the orange sky, while Valaxians moved through the streets in perfect orderly patterns. After 3 months living here as Reltak's official diplomatic consort, Jinnah still found herself stopping to stare at the alien beauty surrounding her. You appear contemplative today, said Nayoung, her human assistant. Earth had insisted Jinnah maintain a human support team during her stay. Just thinking about how different everything is here, Jinnah replied, adjusting her special environment suit. Though the Valaxian atmosphere was breathable for humans, the higher gravity and different light spectrum required protective measures for prolonged exposure. They were walking to the Great Archive, where Jinnah had been granted unprecedented access to Valaxian historical records. As the first human to live among the Valaxians, every day brought new discoveries. The historical elder is waiting for you, Nayoung reminded her. He rarely grants private audiences. Jinnah nodded. This meeting took weeks to arrange. If I can learn more about their touch taboos, it might help us understand their entire social structure. The Great Archive resembled a massive hive, with countless chambers filled with crystalline data storage units. Jinnah was led through winding corridors until they reached a secluded chamber where an ancient Valaxian waited. His exoskeleton had faded to a pale blue, and his movements were slow and deliberate. I am Elder Tolvin, he said, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into human speech. You seek knowledge of our ways. Jinnah bowed in the Valaxian manner, careful not to extend her hands. I am honored by your willingness to share your wisdom, Elder. Your mate bond with High Emissary Reltak grants you certain privileges, Tolvin said, though many question the wisdom of sharing our history with outsiders. Knowledge builds understanding, Jinnah replied. And understanding builds trust. The elder's antennae twitched in what Jinnah had learned was approval. A wise perspective. What do you wish to know? I study your touch protocols extensively, but I don't fully understand their origin. Why are they so central to your society? Tolvin was silent for a moment, his compound eyes reflecting the soft light of the chamber. What has Reltak told you of our telepathic heritage? Very little, Jinnah admitted. Only that your ancestors had stronger abilities than modern Valaxians. A significant understatement, Tolvin said. He moved to a crystal console and activated a holographic display showing ancient Valaxians. 10,000 cycles ago, our species was fully telepathic. All thoughts were shared upon physical contact. The hologram shifted to show 2 Valaxians touching limbs, their heads surrounded by glowing energy. With touch came complete mental connection, Tolvin continued. Beneficial for mates and family units, but dangerous between strangers or rivals. Casual contact could cause severe psychic trauma, even death. So the touch protocols were developed as protection, Jinnah said, pieces falling into place. Yes, the rituals prepared minds for contact. The restrictions prevented accidental harm. Tolvin's antennae drooped slightly. But over generations, our telepathic abilities weakened. Today, most Valaxians retain only fragments of these gifts. Yet the laws remain unchanged, Jinnah noted. Tradition becomes its own justification, given enough time, Tolvin said, with what Jinnah thought might be sadness. The noble castes, who retain stronger telepathic abilities, insist the old ways must be preserved. As they continued their discussion, Jinnah realized something profound. Valaxian society was frozen in time, clinging to protections no longer needed by most of its population. Later that evening, Jinnah sat in the private garden of Reltak's compound, recording her observations. The temporary mate bond had given her access no human had ever received, but also responsibilities she hadn't anticipated. Weekly appearances at council meetings, ceremonial duties, and constant scrutiny from both Valaxians and humans back home. Your meeting with Elder Tolvan was productive, Reltak asked, approaching silently, as was his habit. Jinnah looked up from her notes. Very. He explained much about your telepathic heritage. The Elder is unusually forthcoming with outsiders, Reltak observed, settling onto a specially designed seat across from her. What conclusions have you drawn from this new knowledge? Jinnah considered her words carefully. Their relationship had evolved from awkward diplomacy to something like professional respect, but cultural misunderstandings remain dangerous. I believe your touch protocols once served a vital purpose, she said, but for many Valaxians, they've become restrictions without reason. Traditions that limit rather than protect. She expected Reltak to defend his culture, but instead, his antennae moved in a pattern she recognized as agreement. You perceive much for an outsider, he said quietly. The lower castes have been arguing for reform for generations, but the noble houses resist change. Because the nobles retain stronger telepathic abilities, Jinnah suggested. Precisely. For us, unshielded contact can still be overwhelming. Reltak's compound eyes seem to focus more intently on her, which makes your species fascinating. Your minds are different. Jinnah raised an eyebrow. Different how? When we first touched, the accident that created our bond, I expected a flood of alien thoughts. Instead, I sensed only edges of your consciousness. Humans appear naturally shielded to our perception. This was new information. Jinnah leaned forward. You can't read human thoughts. Not clearly. It is like trying to hear underwater. Reltak made a gesture Jinnah didn't recognize. This is why some council members fear humans. You are unknown variables in our carefully ordered system. A thought struck Jinnah. Could humans learn to control this shielding? To open or close our minds to Valaxian perception? Reltak's antennae shot up in surprise. Such control would be unprecedented. Even among Valaxians, only the highest adepts can modulate telepathic reception. But theoretically possible. Jinnah pressed. Perhaps, with training. Reltak studied her. Why do you ask? If humans could demonstrate controlled mental shielding, it might challenge assumptions about why touch protocols are needed, Jinnah explained. It could provide evidence that control is possible without rigid social restrictions. A dangerous idea, Reltak said, but his tone conveyed interest rather than warning. Over the next few weeks, Jinnah worked with Valaxian telepathic adepts in secret sessions arranged by Reltak. The training was exhausting and progress slow, but gradually Jinnah learned to sense the light touch of Valaxian minds against hers and to control what they could perceive. The breakthrough came during a minor council session discussing interspecies trade regulations. A conservative council member named Mevkar was arguing against expanded human presence in Valaxian markets. Humans cannot understand our ways. Mevkar clicked dismissively. Their minds are chaotic, undisciplined. Physical proximity would disrupt our social harmony. Jinnah, seated beside Reltak as protocol required, felt a surge of frustration. Without thinking, she stood, an unprecedented breach of protocol for a consort. Council member Mevkar, she said clearly, I request permission to demonstrate something important to this discussion. The chamber went silent. No consort had ever directly addressed the council. Reltak, surprisingly, supported her. The council should consider the consort's demonstration before voting. Reluctantly, Mevkar agreed. Jinnah walked to the center of the chamber, where she faced the assembled council. "You believe humans cannot understand Valaxian mental disciplines," she said. "I respectfully disagree." Taking a deep breath, Jinnah extended her hand. Palm up, fingers slightly curled in the formal Valaxian gesture of controlled contact. "I invite any council member to test whether a human can shield or share thoughts by choice." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Such a challenge was unheard of. After a tense moment, Elder Tolvin slowly rose from his seat and approached Jinnah. "You understand what you are proposing?" he asked quietly. Jinnah nodded. "I do, Elder." With ceremonial slowness, Tolvin placed his upper right limb against Jinnah's palm. His antennae immediately stiffened in shock. "Impossible," he whispered. Jinnah closed her eyes, focusing as she'd been taught. First projecting the simple image, Earth's moon rising over mountains, then withdrawing it behind mental barriers. When she opened her eyes, the entire council was leaning forward, antennae rigid with attention. "The human controls her thoughts," Tolvin announced. "She shares or shields at will, with discipline equal to our adepts." The chamber erupted in clicking and whistling as council members debated among themselves. Jinnah returned to her seat beside Reltak, whose antennae were moving in a pattern she'd never seen before. "What you just did," he said softly, "will change everything." "For better or worse?" Jinnah asked. "That remains to be seen," Reltak replied. "But you have demonstrated what some of us have argued for generations, that control, not restriction, is the true path forward." As they left the council chamber, Jinnah noticed younger Valaxians watching her with their antennae vibrating in what she recognized as excitement. Word of her demonstration was already spreading. "I may have just made your position more difficult," she said to Reltak. "The conservative council members won't appreciate this challenge." Reltak's antennae moved in what Jinnah now recognized as his equivalent of a smile. "Perhaps, but you have done what no Valaxian could, questioned our oldest traditions from a position no one can dismiss." "Because I'm an outsider." "Because you are the variable no one anticipated," Reltak corrected. "Neither fully bound by our traditions, nor ignorant of them. You stand between worlds, exactly where change begins." The warning came at night. Jinnah was reviewing cultural exchange proposals when Reltak burst into her quarters, his normally orderly movements sharp with urgency. "You must leave immediately," he said, his translator barely keeping up with his rapid clicks. "Take only what you need." Jinnah stood quickly, recognizing genuine alarm in his posture. "What's happening?" "The traditionalist faction has made its move. 6 council members have been detained. They're calling for the removal of all human influence." Reltak's antennae trembled. "Your demonstration last month catalyzed something we didn't anticipate." Over the 5 months since Jinnah had demonstrated human mental shielding to the council, Valaxian society had begun changing rapidly. Younger Valaxians openly questioned touch protocols. Lower castes demanded reforms. The conservative noble houses had grown increasingly alarmed. "Where would I go?" Jinnah asked, grabbing her emergency pack. "The Earth Embassy." "Too obvious. They'll search there first." Reltak moved to a wall panel and pressed a complex sequence. A hidden door slid open. "This leads to the old tunnel network beneath the city. My aide Senval will guide you to sanctuary with the Reform Coalition." Jinnah hesitated. "What about you? Won't your enemies target you for supporting me?" "My house has ancient protections they cannot easily overcome." Reltak's compound eyes seemed to soften. "But you've become more than a diplomatic arrangement to me, Jinnah. I cannot risk your safety." This was the closest Reltak had ever come to expressing personal feelings. Jinnah felt a complicated mix of emotions, surprise, concern, and something warmer she wasn't ready to name. "I won't run and hide while reformers who supported me are in danger," she said firmly. "That's not how humans handle crisis, nor how Valaxians should." A new voice clicked from the doorway. Elder Tolvin entered, moving with surprising speed for one so ancient. The High Emissariat is right about the danger, but wrong about the solution. Elder Reltak acknowledged with respect. The traditionalists have 7 battle carriers in orbit. They've blockaded the spaceport, and in doing so, have violated our oldest laws about military deployment without full council approval, Tolvin replied. They act out of fear, not wisdom. Jinnah looked between them. What are you suggesting? The Grand Assembly, Tolvin said simply. It has not been convened in 12 generations, but in times of constitutional crisis, any elder can call for it. The assembly of all Valaxian castes, Reltak explained for Jinnah's benefit. Even the traditionalists wouldn't dare ignore that summons. And I'm calling it now, Tolvin said, his antennae set in determination. In 3 days, all factions must appear and make their case before the entire population. Jinnah understood the magnitude of this move. The traditionalists will use it to demand human removal from Valaxian space. Yes, Tolvin agreed. And you will use it to show our people a better path forward. 3 days later, Jinnah stood in an ancient amphitheater carved into the side of a mountain. Hundreds of thousands of Valaxians filled the stone seats, with millions more watching remotely. The air hummed with tension as representatives from every caste and faction took their ceremonial positions. This is unprecedented, Nayun whispered beside her. Humans have never witnessed a grand assembly. Jinnah nodded, trying to project calm despite her racing heart. She wore a formal Earth diplomatic uniform modified with symbols of her status as Reltak's consort, a carefully chosen political statement. The proceedings began with ritual declarations from each faction. The traditionalists spoke first, led by council member Mevkar. Our ancient ways are under attack, he clicked, his translator broadcasting to all present. Foreign influence threatens the very foundations of our society. The human presence has already led to chaos, with youth abandoning proper touch protocols and lower castes demanding privileges beyond their station. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Mevkar detailed the human contamination of Valaxian culture. Jinnah listened carefully, noting which arguments resonated with the audience. When the Reform Coalition spoke, represented by a younger noble named Vintra, they emphasized adaptation rather than abandonment of tradition. Our species has always evolved, Vintra argued. The touch protocols were created to protect, not to divide. As our telepathic abilities change, shouldn't our customs adapt as well? The debate continued for hours, growing increasingly heated. Jinnah watched the crowd's reactions, noticing how the younger Valaxians responded positively to reform arguments, while the older ones clicked in disapproval. Finally, Elder Tolvin rose. As is tradition in the Grand Assembly, we call upon the catalyst of our current situation to speak. Lieutenant Commander Jinnah, diplomatic consort to the 7th House, you may address the Assembly. A hush fell as Jinnah walked to the central speaking platform. She had prepared carefully for this moment, but facing hundreds of thousands of alien eyes still tested her diplomatic training. People of Valaxia, she began, her voice steady. I stand before you as both outsider and consort, neither fully separate from your society nor fully part of it. She paused, letting her translator catch up. The traditionalists fear I represent a threat to your way of life. Their concern is understandable. Change is always frightening, especially when it comes from outside. Jinnah activated a small device, projecting ancient Valaxian script into the air above her. But I have studied your oldest texts in your great archive. With Elder Tolvin's guidance, I've read the original touch laws from the Third Age. She gestured to the floating text. These are not the words of those who feared change. These are the words of those who sought protection and connection. The amphitheater was completely silent now, all antennae focused on the ancient words few living Valaxians had ever seen. Your ancestors wrote, the rituals exist that minds may touch in harmony, not discord. They created protocols to enable safe connection, not to prevent it. Jinnah looked directly at Mevkar. They sought to build bridges between minds, not walls. Jinnah then did something unprecedented. She removed her protective gloves, a violation of diplomatic protocol that caused gasps throughout the crowd. I am human. My mind works differently than yours. Yet with training, I learned to control what thoughts I share through touch. She extended her bare hand. This is not a threat to your culture. It's evidence that connection can exist with protection through skill, not just through separation. Mevkar rose immediately. This display proves our point. The human flaunts our most sacred traditions for theatrical effect. No, Jinnah countered. I honor the true spirit of your traditions by showing that their purpose, safe mental connection, can be achieved through means your ancestors couldn't have foreseen. She gestured toward the younger Valaxians. Your youth aren't rejecting your culture. They're asking why protocols designed for protection have become tools of division. Why touch allowed freely within noble houses is forbidden between castes. Why laws created to prevent harm now prevent growth. A young Valaxian suddenly stood from the lower seating area. A serious breach of protocol. She speaks truth. The protocols were meant to protect, not separate. Guards moved toward the youth, but others stood in support. Soon dozens, then hundreds of younger Valaxians were standing, their antennae vibrating in agreement. Mevkar clicked in outrage. This is the chaos the human has brought. Look at this disrespect for our sacred traditions. Is it disrespect to question? Reltak spoke for the first time, his voice carrying authority. Our greatest scientific and cultural advances came from those who asked why, not those who said never. Elder Tolvin raised his limbs for silence. When the crowd quieted, he spoke with the weight of his position. I have served 12 high councils. I have studied our history longer than most here have lived. And I tell you now, the human speaks truth about our past. He moved to stand beside Jinnah. The touch laws were created as tools for connection, not barriers to it. Over generations, we forgot their purpose and remembered only their form. Jinnah felt the momentum shifting. Countless antennae throughout the amphitheater were moving in patterns of consideration and agreement. I do not ask you to abandon your traditions, she said. I ask only that you remember why they began. Protection through skill and understanding, not separation and fear. She took a data crystal from her pocket, one containing her research on Valaxian history alongside human cultural information. Humans and Valaxians are different species with different minds, but both our peoples value knowledge, protection, and connection. Both our cultures have changed over time. This is not weakness. It's adaptation. It's survival. Jinnah placed the crystal on the central pedestal where all could see it. I offer this knowledge freely to all castes, not just the nobles. Let each Valaxian decide for themselves what traditions serve the future and which belong to the past. This was her most radical proposal, information sharing outside the caste system. For a moment, the amphitheater was completely silent. Then, slowly, Elder Tolvin placed his upper right limb on the crystal, a formal gesture of acceptance. Reltak joined him, then Vintra. One by one, representatives from every faction, except the hardline traditionalists, added their acknowledgement. The Grand Assembly has witnessed, Tolvin announced formally. The path of knowledge stands open to all castes. The Reform Coalition will oversee changes to the touch protocols, preserving their protective purpose while removing unnecessary restrictions. Jinnah stood in disbelief as the amphitheater erupted in clicking and whistling. Approval from thousands of Valaxians. What had begun as a diplomatic crisis had somehow transformed into a turning point for an entire civilization. Later, as they left the amphitheater, Reltak's antennae moved in a pattern Jinnah had never seen before. What does that mean? She asked, exhausted but elated. There is no human translation, he replied. The closest would be pride, but deeper. You have done something no Valaxian could have done. I just reminded them of their own history, Jinnah said.